Beneath the setting sun, a lone Argonian trudged through the swamp. Humidity had congealed the very air, making every strained inhalation a chore. This Argonian was a grave singer, and the burdens he bore on each shoulder weighed heavily upon his hunched form. They also weighed heavily upon his aching heart, but the rusted sky meant time was short, and he needed to reach the glade before the end of eventide. Flesh flies circled above, a pestilent halo above the gravesinger's head, and yet the Argonian in his sodden robes lumbered on. When finally the mire turned to firmer ground, he found a breach in the understory. For the first time in hours, the Argonian raised his head. The clearing was just as serene as when he had first laid eyes on it. That time, his love had walked alongside him, and they had basked in its undisturbed tranquility together. This time, she was draped over his shoulder, eyes closed, never to reopen. At the heart of the glade stood a solitary hist tree, the very same hist tree that stood witness when he first announced his undying love for her. The gravesinger had taken solace in the realization that the love truly was undying, for even after her departure from the living, the power of it refused to subside, and burned with the ferocity of the sun that sat perched on the horizon in this very moment, watching, mourning with him. The gravesinger lay his love in the shade of the hist tree, nestled in the embrace of its exposed roots. He sat beside her in the slowly darkening dusk, and began to etch her story upon the gravestake he had carried on his other shoulder. He recollected the stories of her youth, before the hist had blessed him, bringing her into his life. He carved their home and their children, her favourite foods and places. He tried to replicate upon the stake the way she would paint her scales, using the same pigments, yet he couldn't capture her vibrancy. At the crest of the stake, he carved this very scene twice. Once on their first visit, when their tails intertwined and their bodies coalesced, and their souls had been bound inextricably to one another. And when the stake was prepared, he took his love to the crucible of sap at the base of the hist tree. In the last glimmers of twilight, with the boughs and leaves above bearing witness once more, he did announce his undying love again. He submerged her beneath the amber ichor. He gazed one final time upon her face, upon the intricate lines of her scales that had endured so many years and suffered hardships that no mother should have to suffer. But the gravesinger wept tears of elation, for she was weightless as the sap took her under. The hist would cherish her immortal spirit beneath the soil, while he cherished it from above. Hands dripping with sap, the gravesinger sat at the foot of the tree and watched the sun set over the glade. The grief constricted him, squeezing the will to live from his chest. But the gravesinger smiled. His role in the tribe was to guide the dead back to the embrace of the hist, so that they might complete their spiritual journey and water the hist with their accumulated wisdom and experiences, for the betterment of Blackmarsh and all the Argonians dwelling there. After all, every Saxleal lived in service of the hist. They were the people of the root, and so long as the trees lived and the sap flowed, the soul of every Argonian would live too. New life would gestate within the sap, and from those eggs, new Argonians would grow, coded with the genetic memory of those who came before. And when the gravesinger passed, more young lovers would stumble across this picturesque glade and make love and forge memories of their own. To be mortal is to accept impermanence, and this is fundamental to Saxleal culture. But to have a soul was to be eternal. Night had fallen, and but for the glow emanating from the crucible, darkness had closed in. The gravesinger lay himself down, closed his eyes against the tears, and let sleep envelop him. More often than not, when we encounter Argonians in Tamriel, we see individuals who have been brought up away from their native culture. To many of the other races, the Argonians are different physiologically, what with their frills and claws, tails and scales. They're sent to the slums or treated as sentient farm equipment. And this kind of dehumanization is easy for the other races, as the Argonians are the only race who truly seem to have no meaningful connection to the old and wandering Elnathay. Khajiit spirituality ties them to the other races of Mer, both in terms of origin story and their pantheon of gods, and this worship can be practiced all over the continent. The Argonians, however, worship their trees and perceive the mortal realm in their own unique way. If they stray too far from the influence of the Hist, they lose an intrinsic part of their identity. But we're going to wade into the murky depths of Argonia to understand just how alien this race truly is. For when you wander into Blackmarsh, it genuinely feels like being transported to another realm entirely. And if one of the foremost accounts of the mortal world's creation story, the annotated Annuad, is to be believed, that intuition is not too far from reality. Like the monomyth, the Annuad also depicts the interplay of Anu and Padamai, but in the latter text, this mingling of light and darkness is portrayed as more of a destructive conflict, rather than a collaborative creative force. Their primordial dance created the spirit called Nur, and they were amazed and delighted with her appearance. But Nur fell in love with Anu and spurned Padamai. This caused their interplay to become a battle. With Anu, Nur became pregnant. But before she could give birth to creation, Padamai returned, and the sight of her, heavy with Anu's light, drove him into a dark and profound rage. Padamai struck Nur, and though Anu was able to drive him away, and Nur was able to give birth, she died in the throes of her maternal duties, weakened by her injuries. She had duodecaplets, 12 children, 12 worlds of creation. Life burgeoned on each, but soon Padamai returned. He saw creation, and he despised it. In his ire, Padamai swung his mighty sword, and shattered the 12 worlds in their alignment. Anu returned, and the two forces duelled across the orbis. Anu emerged victorious, and used what remained of his power to form one world from the remnants of the 12 sundered worlds. He named it Nirn after his beloved. In the world of Nirn, mayhem was abound, for despite Anu's orderly nature, the mark of Padamai's chaos could not be mended. Their divine conflict left scars, and these scars served as borders between lands that had no right existing on the same planet. The Annuad reads, "The only survivors of the 12 worlds of creation were the Elnafey and the Hist. The Elnafey are the ancestors of Mer and men, the Hist are the trees of Argonia. So, while all the races of Dawn's Beauty can trace their lineage back to these Elnafey, the lizard folk most certainly cannot. The old Elnafey, the ancestors to elfkind, warred with the Wanderers, the ancestors to mankind, and the Hist kept to themselves, neutral onlookers in their alien corner of Tamriel." The Annuad states, "Over many years, the Elnafey of Tamriel became the Mer, Elves, the Dwemer, the Kaima, the Dunmer, the Bosmer, the Altmer. On the other continents, the wandering Elnafey became the men, the Nords of Atmora, the Redguards of Yakuda, the Sayesi of Akavir. The Hist were bystanders in the Elnafey war, but most of their realm was destroyed as the war passed over it. A small corner of it survived to become Blackmarsh in Tamriel, but most of their realm was sunk beneath the sea. Every known race gets a mention, excepting the races that would inevitably descend from those already mentioned, like the Bretons, Imperials and Orsimer. Khajiit origins are a little more dubious, but if the catfolk are to be believed, Azura plucked them from the old Elnafey and turned them into the fastest, cleverest, most beautiful of elves. The Argonians, though, have no origin story. No sources claim they sprouted from the Elnafey. No spiritual leaders denounce the notion that they are merely sapient beasts. We know that the Aedra, Ifri in particular, shaped the green and populated Nirn with flora and fauna, with the exception of the Hist, of course. So, it seems undeniable then that the Argonians must have evolved from the fauna that came to populate Blackmarsh. Depending on the tribe, you may find variations of the Argonian creation myth, but there is one thing they are all united on, an intrinsic part of their cognitive experience. The Argonians were created by the Hist. This puts the Argonians in a rather unique position, being the only Tamrielic race with constant, tangible access to their gods. I'm sure any ordinators watching will respond to that with a lecture on the glory of the Tribunal Temple, but I don't mean demigods with stolen divinity, I mean true godhood. On the channel, we often talk about the nature of the gods and their relationships with one another, but the Hist throw a Dwemer strut in the works, for they answer to no one. The Hist are incongruent with the other spirits of creation, in the same way the Argonians are with the races of man and Mer. So how did the Hist create the Argonians, and for what purpose? Well, to answer that, we ought to discuss the nature of the Hist trees. It is possible that the Hist transcends the confines of the physical. Some scholars theorize that the Hist is actually a force that exists all over Tamriel, like the Ultima travel writer Sithis, who claims the Hist supposedly emanates from all nature in Tamriel, but there is little clear evidence of this. What we do know, as Sithis continues, is that the Hist is particularly strong in Hist trees, large, usually ancient growths found at the centre of every sizable Argonian settlement. These Hist trees contain, the Argonians believe, the collective memories and knowledge of all Argonians. And to add an Argonian perspective, there is the Infernal City and Lord of Souls novels by Greg Keyes, which feature an Argonian protagonist named Mir Glim. He says, "The Hist were many, and they were one. Their roots buried deep beneath the black soul and soft white stone of Blackmarsh, connecting them all, and thus connecting all Saxleal, all Argonians. The Hist gave his people life, form, purpose." What these sources are describing is a hive mind. But for all their preternatural power, the Hist have weaknesses. They cannot move, they cannot speak, they cannot perceive the world in the way mortals can. Of course, they have other senses that would make little sense to mortals like you or I. But the Hist stood as silent sentries while the Elnathay made war, while they built empires and conquered lands. The concept of trees communicating in methods beyond mortal senses is not some fantastical idea, dreamed up by Todd or Tolkien. This communication is very real in our universe, only no one pays attention. Human brains are a labyrinth of chemicals and electrical signals, but trees pass electrical impulses too, albeit at a tiny fraction of the pace. In symbiosis with fungi, called mycorrhiza, trees send chemical, hormonal, and electrical signals through their network. If a giraffe starts eating an African acacia, the tree releases a chemical into the air that signals that a threat is at hand. Even before the giraffe reaches them, neighbouring trees begin producing toxic chemicals. Similarly with insects, a tree will taste the saliva of the insect and release the appropriate chemical to attract that specific insect's predator. Or when a tree has been harvested by mortals, there is evidence to suggest its peers will nourish the stump of the felled tree for centuries, feeding it sugars and nutrients. What I'm trying to say is, the Hist knew how to protect their corner of the continent, but as trees rooted to the earth, they couldn't do it all alone. So what did the Hist do? Well, they decided to mimic the gods of men and Mer by creating their own race of sapient mortals. Were they not gods after all? To be served and worshipped by lesser entities that possessed sufficient intelligence to exercise obeisance, but not so much that they would liberate themselves. What the Hist needed was AI. So, the Hist created artificial intelligence, intelligent beasts that would be born from the Hist and die for the Hist, that would experience mortality, accrue wisdom, exchange ideas, engage in conflict, fall in love, all in service of the hive mind. The Hist were taking note of how the other spirits interacted with the limitful nature of the Mundus. It's quite like the Ultima creation story, as written in the monomyth. An excerpt reads, "Anu encompassed and encompasses all things. So that he might know himself, he created Anwiel, his soul and the soul of all things. Anwiel, as all souls, was given to self-reflection, and for this he needed to differentiate between his forms, attributes and intellects. Thus was born Sithis, who was the sum of all the limitations Anwiel would utilize to ponder himself. Anwiel, who was the soul of all things, therefore became many things, and this interplay was and is the Orbis. Anu created less potent souls that were in essence parts of Anu, but who possessed individual will, so that their experiences could help Anu attain a higher level of understanding. This is what the Hist imitated when creating the Argonians. The commonly held theory for the creation of the Argonians is quite unbelievable. You see this lizard, minding his own business, sunning himself on a rock. That is an ancestor lizard, and I'm sure you can guess why it possesses that particular name. That's because you're looking at the lizard that the Hist used as the foundation of the Argonian people. According to the Hellstrom ancestor lizard description in ESO, some scholars believe Argonians are descended, or were uplifted, from these tree-dwelling swamp lizards. But we're not going to base our understanding of such a crucial piece of lore on nothing but the Crown Store. From the Loremaster's archive, we can find mention of some lithographic prints detailing the Argonian parable of becoming. And from these lithographs comes the notion that the Hist saw the evolutionary utility in the races of Man and Mer inhabiting Tamriel. Their physiology and larger brains were clearly pragmatic for their survival and aptitude for innovation. And from this comes the allegory of the Hist perceiving humans and elves, admiring their walking legs and clever hands, and then moulding and remoulding the swamp's useful lizards until they found they had made Argonians. It's as compelling an origin story as any other. After all, no other god seemed to take credit for creating them. With all of this taken into account, you can see why the connection between Hist and Argonian is so profound. You can see why the Argonians, at least the ones with a connection to their homeland, are so adamant that their souls are one with the trees. Mirglim ponders the nature of his intelligence often in the Infernal City novel. Another of his quotes reads, "It was generally believed that Argonians had been given their souls by the Hist, and when one died, one's souls returned to them, to be incarnated once more. To Glim that seemed reasonable enough, at least under ordinary circumstances. In the deepest parts of his dreams or profound thinking were images, scents, tastes that the part of him that was sentient could not remember experiencing. Perhaps these formative experiences that make up the basis of his consciousness come from a time before sapience, from when his people were merely sentient." And it also aligns with the Hivemind notion. As a child of the root, he is a part of the same Hist database as every other Argonian. The Lord of Souls novel adds this about the connection between Hist and Argonian. They are sentient trees, and we are connected to them. They are many and they are one, all attached at the root, and we too are joined at that root. Some say we were created by the Hist, to see for them the world where they cannot walk. They can call us or send us away. When we are named, we take of the sap of the Hist, and we are changed, sometimes a little, sometimes very much. And there are plenty of Argonians who comment on their experiences with this same innate unanimity. Sap speakers and tree minders are among the Argonians who have the closest physical connection to the Hist. Their lives revolve around communing with the Hivemind through sap ingestion, or merely proximity to the trees. Treeminder Diapa states, "When an Argonian is created, it is said that the sap becomes the Argonian's blood, its essence, its spirit." I could keep going, but I think we've established pretty well at this point that the Argonians are creations of the Hist, and everything that makes them sapient emanates from the Hist. So, the Hist are the puppet masters. They created lizard AI constructs, with a kind of machine learning, designed to obtain knowledge and experience that could be returned to the hive. The Argonians are ambassadors, scouts, envoys, they're scaled satellites. And as you can imagine, this leads the lizard folk to be quite unlike the other Tamrielic races. It manifests both physically and mentally. In terms of physical differences, there are plenty, going far beyond the fact that they're bipedal lizards. Firstly, the synergy between Saxhleel and Hist is so crucial that Argonians born too far from the swamps are physically and mentally altered by the disconnection. The Infernal City novel states, "Argonians can always feel the presence of the Hist while in the marsh. It is said that if they wander too far away from it, they lose its touch." And there are plenty of stories of such cases, enough to coin the term Lukiel among the Argonians, which means assimilated people. One noteworthy example is the strange case of Jarit. In Argonian society, he is disadvantaged. He's unable to read social cues, the subtle movements of muscle and tail that most of us take for granted. We occasionally have difficulty reading the emotions of other races. Jarit has that problem even with fellow Argonians. He listens to spoken words and is insensitive to their tone. Surely being born away from the Hist has deprived him of emotional intuition. The thing is though, most of this can be chalked up to simply not understanding one's native culture. The same can be said for any second-generation immigrant. It does seem as though the Hist have tried to account for the inevitable fact that Argonians will spread beyond the marshes and their immediate influence. Argonians are usually hatched from eggs, which rest in nests at the foot of a Hist tree. But due to their humanoid physiology, it is also believed that female Argonians can have live births, where the eggs hatch internally. Funnily enough, despite the wealth of knowledge we have about the lore of the Elder Scrolls universe, the topic of childbirth is rather ambiguous. There isn't even a strong consensus on whether newborns take the race of the mother, or if crossbreeds like the Bretons can happen. And I won't even bother talking about Argonian breasts. I guess for the sake of game mechanics, the developers have always strayed away from the birds and the bees. I mentioned sap speakers, who drink sap and eat Hist fruit before meditating in order to interpret the will of the Hist. But the ingestion of Hist sap can have even more potent effects. If the Hist gave Argonians their sapient forms, and they weren't stripped of most of their power like the Aedra, what's stopping them from continuing to alter the forms of their children? For the record, I would associate the Hist and their powers more with the Daedra than the Aedra. Firstly, the Hist were only bystanders in creation. But secondly, it is believed that the Daedra cannot truly create, but can rather imitate, alter, or corrupt what already exists, and then place it in their own realm. The Hist altered the ancestor lizards, creatures that would have initially been created by Ifri and his green songs. Only unlike the Daedric princes, the realm of the Hist is within Nirn itself. In some respects, Black Marsh is a Daedric plane. Perhaps that's why no foreign power has truly been able to conquer it. Looking at you, Riemann Empire, you call that a conquest? It's like dipping your toe in the swimming pool and saying you swam its length. Anyway, I digress. We were talking about the Hist making ongoing alterations. Since the Hist bestowed walking legs and clever hands upon the Argonians, why stop there? According to myths and legends of the Hist, when a Saxhleel emerges from juvenescence, it finds a nearby Hist tree to lick sap from its bowl. The elements in the sap quicken the hormonal glands, which sprout appropriate organs from which the Argonian's gender can be determined. Through the consumption of sap, an Argonian's DNA can be altered. The Hist essentially enter character creation mode. They can determine the Argonian's gender, but also its physical makeup. Take the Argonian behemoth. These beasts are created by the Hist to protect sacred sites and test the mettle of novice warriors. Doubtless the Hist would have utilised such shape-shifting abilities to create an unstoppable force capable of quelling even Daedric invasions. The potential ramifications of one race having so much freedom to change their physical forms are immense, but because the Argonians are generally isolationist and care more about the well-being of their swamps and their trees than expanding into other provinces, we have yet to truly see this power utilised. As for mental differences, Argonians diverge drastically when it comes to beliefs, values, and their interpretation of existential questions, like what it means to be mortal. If their inherent purpose in life is to deliver information to the histories, then it should come as no surprise that the Argonians have a unique perspective on death. Another of Mirglim's musings. To Glim's people, at least the most traditional ones, birth and death were the same moment. All of life, all of history, was one moment, and only by ignoring most of its content could one create the illusion of linear progression. The agreement to see things in this limited way was what other peoples called time. This introspective Argonian has tapped into the eternalist view of the gods, the notion that time is relative, and that it's a concept only relevant to finite things within the grasp of the time dragon's claws. This could be a piece of transcendental wisdom obtained from the ingestion of Hist sap, For if the Hist are gods, then they are not subject to the passage of time. A quote I often cite comes from Chamberlain Haskell. Inhabitants of the Shivering Isles are affected by time, but we are not subject to it. We are subjects of Lord Sheogorath, who subjects us to whatever subjects he is in the mood to subjudicate, because time is subjective. Of course, Argonians are mortal. They are subject to time. They live every day like every other Tamrielic race. But unlike most of their neighbours, the Argonians are not concerned about their slow decay. The purpose they serve goes far beyond their own egos. Treeminder Diapa goes as far as to say, this existence is unnatural for us. Our spirits must return to the Hist. And this is why funeral rites are so critical to the Saxleal people. In order to return to the Hist, the cadaver must be allowed to deteriorate in the bogs. They must rot and fester and become soil, and their memories are the nutrients that make their way back to the roots. If an Argonian dies in a foreign land, or trapped by stone walls and cobbled floors, they are unable to find peace. And this is why grave singers are so important among the tribes of Blackmarsh. They are far more than just grave diggers. They are responsible for aiding Argonians in their spiritual passage, helping them reach the warm embrace of the hive. To honour the memory of passing Argonians, the tribe or loved ones of the deceased will prepare a zulvat, or grave stake. This stake serves a double purpose. It is carved with depictions of the Argonians' life story. It also serves a practical purpose, keeping the corpse pinned in its resting place. Due to the prevalence of parasites in the marshes, which are usually useful for preventing outsiders from invading the region, cadavers of deceased Argonians are susceptible to returning from the dead as bog blights. The most important aspect of this Argonian burial rite, in my opinion, is what these grave stakes say about their values. These stakes may endure for years, or they may follow the path of the deceased, decaying and returning to nature. In the words of gravesinger Zaliz, they are memorials of lifetimes past. As the years progress, we carve our story upon the wood, our triumphs and fears, our laughter and follies. All must be remembered. As gravesinger, it is my sworn duty to protect these memories. But as far as memorials go, grave stakes could be perceived as meagre. Mortals are obsessed with their legacies. In the Elder Scrolls universe, the Aelids built their glorious empire and constructed a mighty obelisk in emulation of Tower Zero. The Ultima capital of Alinor is a hypnotic swirl of ramparts and impossibly high towers, designed to catch the light of the sun and break it to its component colours, which lie draped across its stones until you're thankful for nightfall. You could even say they're trying to reach heaven through architecture. In our universe, you have the likes of Ramesses the Great, or Ozymandias as he was known to the Greeks. But Ozymandias' shattered visage, half sunk in the sand, is a testament to the belief that all efforts to achieve permanence in a realm of mortals is hubris. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The Argonians embrace the impermanence of life. They accept their place as finite beings in a finite universe, obtaining experiences to return to their overlords. It is possible that that attitude is new, for remnants of the distant past persist in the marsh. Stone ziggurats called Zanmirs can be found across Argonia. The leading theory for this part of Argonian culture is that they venerated Sithis, not so much out of love, but out of fear. They viewed him as a destroyer, a force of unbridled chaos. Perhaps this reverence was a byproduct of their sudden elevation from mindless Pagona to the vastness of sapience. Yes, the Hist meticulously designed the Argonians, but to the rapidly evolving brain of the reptile, it must have felt like the birthing of universes. The Saxleal constructed these Zanmirs in honour of the destroyer, but eventually the lizard folk discovered their connection to the trees, and this led to an event known as Duskfall. When asked about the event, some Argonians, like Niswo Zod, claim that the Hist revealed the true path. The Hist showed the purpose of Sithis, his utility. He was not a destroyer for destruction's sake. Rather, Sithis is change, Sithis tears down the old so that the new can grow. So we learn to flow with the river, instead of struggle to alter its course. While we don't know the specific details of Duskfall, it seems the event was less of a physical cataclysm and more of a paradigm shift in Saxhleel society. And this is when the Argonians began to preach the concept of Shunate, the relinquishing of material anxieties, of the fear of death and forgetting. Talon Josh of Root Whisper Village describes it as follows. Shunate means something along the lines of regretful stomach in the dry-skinned tongue. It is the pain caused by holding on too tightly to that which has come to pass. Sorrow, anger, suffering, if you do not let them go, they will consume you. Of course, our culture revolves around accepting change. We build homes of wood, knowing they will break in the storm and be rebuilt again. Know that all things are not permanent, and accept that. Only then can you find peace. To disregard the notion of permanence, and of legacy, and of material possessions, is to shed ego. The Hist don't want their AI envoys to be overly individualistic. The Hist want them to be devoted to the principal ambition of providing knowledge to the Hivemind. Some form of ego is necessary, of course, as the Argonians can't sit cross-legged in deep contemplation all their lives. There must be a drive to garner wisdom and new experiences. But ultimately, they serve the will of the Hist, and that is why they are so adaptable, changing gender and physiology and mental state with no more encouragement than a lick of Hist Sap. The Argonians are artificial intelligence, in artificially constructed bodies, with enough independence to machine learn for the benefit of the static Hist masterminds. They are born from the Hist, and they return to the trees upon death, where they are stripped of their egos and embrace the bliss of the collective whole. And there you have it, guys. The last thing I want to do is contribute to the dehumanization of the Argonians. I'm sure any Dark Elves who stumble across my research will have a field day with it, but I hope you learned something new about the lizard folk from this video. Say what you will about the Argonians, but there is no doubt that they are one of, if not the most, unique races inhabiting Tamriel. Just beware the swamps of Argonia, for that land is untamed, unconquered, and truly alien. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. My name is Drew, you've been watching Drew Mora, and I'll see you in the next one.